Are there degrees of freedom and responsibility? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is St. Joe Society Podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at stjosephsociety.org. All right, this is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 19. Okay, and in this episode, we're going to talk about different modifiers of freedom. We're going to try to answer the question, are there degrees of freedom and responsibility? Since we've discussed freedom and responsibility are codependent with one another. Okay, last week we talked about moral responsibility and its relationship to freedom. We also talked about the principle of double effect. And I know for a 15-minute podcast, that was a lot. What I did, though, is if you guys check out on our website, the usual monthly handout I give you guys, the 4 principles of the principle of double effect are in there. Okay, I know I mentioned last week you can Google it, and you can certainly do that. But I also put that on that document. So if you guys want to pull that up and go through it, it's not too terribly difficult when you get it in front of you and give yourself some time to think through it. But it's a ridiculously important topic and one that hopefully at your monthly meeting, you guys will discuss a little bit. But that is there for you if you guys need it. This week, we're going to talk about how our freedom can be modified and then how this affects our responsibility. Okay. So as we've said, responsibility and freedom. So we are responsible for our actions when our actions are done freely. Okay. So we are responsible for human acts because human acts proceed from deliberation, which is an activity of the intellect and the will. Okay. And because those actions can be ascribed to us, we're responsible for the consequences. Now, as we talked about last week, some consequences, that's a principle of double effect, some consequences of our actions we are not morally responsible for, okay, even though they are tied to what we did. And that's what the principle of double effect tries to answer, which I'm not going to go back into that, but that was the occasion for us bringing that up. What I want to talk about is how our freedom can be taken away. And I want to start by looking at the 3 types of ways you can be free, okay? So an action can be perfectly free, imperfectly free, and freedom can be wholly lacking, okay? So perfect freedom, when you do something perfectly free, that's when you have full knowledge and full consent. So notice the intellect and will there. Full knowledge, you know what you're doing, and you're freely consenting to do it. Imperfect freedom, okay, when freedom's imperfect, it's that there's something wanting in your knowledge or consent or both to some degree. So when your freedom is imperfect, what that means is there's something messing with your freedom, okay, whether it comes from ignorance, you don't really realize what it is you're doing, or some other aspect of your consent, there's something influencing it. Those are imperfect, okay? Now, these are going to be very relevant because, like we said, freedom and responsibility are codependent. So when your freedom starts to become imperfect, you're not as responsible for what you're doing. Okay. Now I'm going to argue you're still responsible, but your responsibility does go down. So think, for example, when a person has an addiction, okay, they are not fully and perfectly consenting to that, okay, because the addiction legitimately takes away some of their freedom. A person who's addicted to crack cocaine, he's not free not to do it. Okay, that's what addiction is. Okay. But we wouldn't say he has no freedom. We'd say that his freedom to do or not to, it's very imperfect. So it's heavily influenced by that addiction. Okay. That's how that works. All right. The last category would be no freedom. Okay. So freedom is wholly lacking. This is when knowledge is wholly lacking or consent is wholly lacking. In this occasion, the action that's done is not done freely. Okay. And I'll unpack that more as we get into there. All right. So you guys can do things. You can have perfect freedom, imperfect, or your freedom can be wholly lacking. Now, there are lots of stuff that influences our freedom. We are going to talk about 3, and I know this is an intro to moral theology, so we're going to take a broad flyover because this can be a complicated issue. But I picked 3 that I think would touch you guys most, kind of hit closest home for you. The first is ignorance. So we're going to talk about what ignorance does to our freedom. Then we're going to talk about what our passions do. And then finally, how habits influence. And then we'll wrap up this episode by talking about how our rule of life help us to solve these issues of how these 3 things mess with our freedom. Well, let's start with ignorance. Okay. When you are ignorant of what you're doing, okay, when you're doing something perfectly freely, you have complete knowledge of what you're doing. imperfect, you have partial knowledge. If you're not free at all, you have no knowledge. Okay. Now, when we are ignorant of something, it's not just simple enough to say, well, he's ignorant of the rules, therefore he's off the hook. It's not that simple. Okay. When we are ignorant of something, our ignorance can come in two ways. Our ignorance can be vincible and our ignorance can be invincible. Now, vincible ignorance is the case when you are truly ignorant, but your ignorance is your fault, okay? Because you could have overcome it, all right? So when you are vincibly ignorant of something, you are still responsible for what it is that you did, okay? Vincible ignorance does not destroy freedom, though it could lessen it. So let's take when you guys get a driver's license. When you get your driver's license, what you're telling the state of Ohio by getting that is that you know all of the rules of the road, okay? If you get pulled over and you break some sort of law, okay, some sort of rule of the road, and you say, well, I didn't know that, ignorance in that situation is not an excuse because your ignorance would be vincible because you are supposed to know that. You clearly didn't put the effort in to know it, so you're still held accountable for it. That's a good example of vincible ignorance, okay? Invincible ignorance is when you're ignorant of something and it can't be overcome by you attaining the required knowledge, okay? So invincible ignorance is when you don't know something and it's not your fault. Invincible ignorance destroys freedom because knowledge is necessary for freedom. Remember, to do a human act, you have to know what it is you're doing, okay? If you are truly invincibly ignorant, you don't know what you're doing. You know, in cases of when people plead insanity, right? They do something illegal, really bad, and they plead insanity. Well, one, it's very difficult for judges to accept that. But if it would be granted, they're saying they're invincibly ignorant. They don't know the difference between right and wrong. Therefore, punishing them for said crime would be unjust. Okay. If you're truly invincibly ignorant of something, you are off the hook. All right. Let's take, for example, let's say you guys walk in to buy something in the grocery store. And, they take that little fluorescent marker or whatever and see if the $100 bill is real. Let's say they mark it and they find out it's not real. So you're trying to buy something with counterfeit money. Now that's illegal to do. That's immoral to do. If you could say, listen, I didn't know that was counterfeit money. I don't make counterfeit money. I got that $100 bill from the Fifth Third Bank down the road. I just got out of the bank a minute ago. You got to talk to them about this. If you can show that you truly didn't know it was counterfeit, then even though you tried to buy something with counterfeit money, you wouldn't be morally accountable for it. Okay, more morally responsible, I should say. Make sense? So ignorance messes with our freedom, but it messes with it to various degrees if it's invincible, and it takes it away completely it takes away completely if it's invincible. It messes with it by degrees if it's invincible. Sorry, I flopped those two around. All right. Next one, passion. Okay. What in the world is a passion? When I say passions mess with your freedom, what do I mean by that? A passion is a very strong motion of the sensitive appetite for pleasure or arduous goods. Remember back in Unit 2, we talked about the concupiscible appetite and the irascible appetite. A passion is a strong movement of those, okay? So they include tons of things, desires for food, drink, and sex, your fight or flight feelings, which would be part of the irascible appetite. When these strong movements happen, as you know, it can mess with your freedom a little bit. Okay. When you're really scared, it's difficult to act. Okay. Think of someone who's deathly terrified of giving a speech. Okay. They'll get up in front of the audience and something that used to be easy, namely talking, becomes for some people impossible to do. They are not free to speak because their fear so overwhelms them. So that's a good example of how a passion can take away someone's freedom to do something even as simple as talking, okay? Now, when we talk about passions are two basic types. The first is what's called an antecedent passion. The second is called a consequent passion. Now, antecedent passions are passions that spring up before you act. That's why they're called antecedent. They're emotions that spring up before you make a choice, okay? Antecedent passions, you are not morally responsible for them, okay? Think if you guys go to mass and you say, Father, forgive me for I've sinned. I was tempted to do such and such. Okay, being tempted to do something is not sinful. In fact, we don't have a whole lot of control over our temptations. Okay, maybe in the long run we do, but in the short run we don't. So when these temptations pop up, that's an antecedent passion, right? You have this feeling or this desire pop up. You haven't sinned. Those are antecedent. Okay, those aren't even human acts. Antecedent passions arise spontaneously. Okay. Now, consequent passions are of a different order. Okay. Consequent passions are the passions you get after you act. These you are morally accountable for because your action feeds them or takes them away. So notice an antecedent passion can become a consequent one based on your choices. So as I teach teenage boys, say, listen, if you see a pretty girl walk down the road and you think she's attractive, that's an antecedent passion. You didn't do anything wrong. Okay. Now, what you do with that feeling, what you do with those thoughts, you are morally accountable for. And we all know that it's perfectly possible to look at a pretty girl and say, wow, what a pretty girl. And then you move your mind onto other things. No sin. Most guys, if not all, will have the experience of not dealing with that thought as virtuously as they could have. And what happens when you dwell on that thought, okay, in a sinful or vicious way, it increases that passion. Well, you're morally responsible for that passion because it's a consequent one. All right. So antecedent passions generally don't take our freedom away. Okay. And then ironically, consequent passions not only don't take our freedom away, they can increase our accountability, our responsibility for them. Okay. Because we had a say in how they went. All right. Okay. So that's passions. Last one, habit. I'm going to wrap this episode up. What is a habit? We're going to get into this a lot in the future. Okay. I think I have a whole unit full of episodes on the virtuous life. So we're going to talk about habits a whole bunch. But what a habit is, it's a firm, stable disposition for acting a certain way. So when you have a habit, you are predisposed by having this habit to act a certain way. So you have a habit of biting your nails, right? Or that's kind of a non-rational habit. You're predisposed to do that activity. If you have a good habit of, you can shoot foul shots really well if you're a basketball player, then when you shoot foul shots, you are in a habit of making them. Okay. So habits are these stable dispositions that you can act on kind of whenever. Now, as we'll talk about in the future, habits can be good or bad, right? You can have good habits, which are called virtues. You can have bad habits, which are called vices. But this is how habits work. Now, our habits influence our freedom. If you have the habit of playing the piano well, then you are free to play the piano. If you don't have that habit, you're not free to play it. If you have the habit of, smoking methamphetamines, at the end of the day, you're not totally free to not do that. If you don't have that habit, you have the habit of sobriety, you don't do those sort of things. So our habits, okay, do influence our freedom. There's a voluntary aspect to habits because we do have to cooperate with them. Okay, we can choose not to act on bad ones and we can choose to try to develop good ones. When we recognize we have good habits, we need to put effort into keeping them. We're morally responsible to do that. If we recognize we have a bad habit, we are morally responsible, morally obligated to try to defeat it. Okay, at least put effort into it. Even if the effort's microscopic, we have to be trying to work to get better at the things, to get rid of bad habits and to build good ones. Because our habits do make us more free to become the men God wanted to be, or less free to do so. And when we talked about what freedom was a couple weeks ago, that was kind of a point I was trying to drive in, is that we actually have say in how this works. Okay. Which brings us to our application for the week. Guys, our freedom can be messed with through our knowledge or lack thereof. It can be brought about through our passions, which can be spontaneous, or we have a little bit of say in what they do, and also by the habits that we develop. Okay. In order to live a Christ-like life, okay, in order to be more free, we need to do three things: make progress in virtue. So develop good habits so that we pursue good things and not bad. We need to increase in our knowledge of the good. Okay. So we're not ignorant of what's right and wrong. And we need to increase our self-discipline and asceticism. As you guys notice, our rule of life addresses all three, which is why we encourage you guys to live that rule of life, to be committed to it so that you can be the free men that God wants you to be. All right. We'll wrap up there for this week. Hope you guys have a blessed week.